Lammers,
Present.
Wendy Anderson,
Present.
Tyler Malberg,
Present.
Sarah Lee Morrissey. Not yet. Bob Fitzsimmons. Yes.
Yes.
John Hoblick. Okay. Jessica Gow,
Here.
Jack Surratt,
Here.
Elias Tobias,
Here.
Bliss Jameson, Bill Lights. Yes. No. Bernie Lafitte and Alex Zelensky. Thank you.
Ginger, were you going to go through some housekeeping items?
Yes, thank you. Ginger Dare, Environmental Management Director. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Seems like you figured it all out, but the microphones, you want to leave them off when you're not speaking and only turn them on when you are speaking. On is when the light comes on. So you want to make sure the lights are off until you want to speak. And then the screen sort of indicates that you can like hit the button to be recognized. We're not going to use that today because it's tied to the council members. And so it won't really work for our purposes. So Carrie, do you want them to flip their name tag? So if you just flip your little name tag up, if you want to speak, then Carrie will know that you want to speak. And then there are restrooms through this exit door right here. So if you need to get up during the meeting, that's the closest restroom is right there through that exit door. There are also restrooms if you go to room 200, but that's a little bit further. That's it.
We want to recognize Sarah Lee is here. And Bill Lights did text that he'll be running a little late. You'll see him walk in. Okay, approval of minutes. Was the minutes on the website?
We're on the web, and I believe I sent them out. Yes.
Yes. And so any comments or questions on the minutes? Okay. Do
I move to approve.
we have a second? Okay, by Bliss. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Approval of minutes. And now presentations.
And I forgot one announcement, which is we do have audience members. So there are comment cards in the back. If anyone wants to speak, you fill out the comment card, hand it to Brianna over here, and she'll make sure that that Carrie gets it so that you can speak. And we also do have a sign-in sheet in the back, so we'd appreciate if people would sign in. And then presentation. So at our last meeting, you gave us a list of things that you wanted to talk about here today. And hopefully we've covered them all. Will you click on the PowerPoint? There we go. And so on our webpage, hopefully everybody found this. We had the agenda, the PowerPoint, a lot of background documentation, the minutes from last time. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any suggestions or you want it to be some other way, or just constructive criticism, let us know. We'll plan to do it the same way from here on out, but happy to take any kind of suggestions on that. So last meeting, what you had requested for this meeting was an overview of the comprehensive plan, information about the Volusia County Charter, an understanding of how land use zoning and land development work together and sort of the process that a project goes to get approved. Then the environmental minimum standards and the implementing ordinances associated with that. You wanted a primer on low impact development. And then we have our goal setting. So the resolution says that you'll have an annual work plan and some goal setting. So that's kind of at the end of the meeting. What we're hoping to do is get some of the educational stuff, and so you have plenty of time at the end for the goal setting. But we do have to keep to our 2 hours today because there's someone else in the room after us. So just sort of this slide is really just to kind of get everybody's mind around sort of what the hierarchy is of the regulatory system for local governments, not just us. And we'll talk about each of these elements. Well, we won't talk a lot about permits, but we'll talk about this as we go, but just sort of as a way to visualize, there's sort of a big picture, and it kind of, a development moves through to these, more granular, more detailed levels. So the big picture really is the comprehensive plan, including the future land use that's assigned to all property in the county. So we'll talk about that. Then in our case, we have environmental minimum standards. That again is sort of a big picture item that then narrows down into specific regulations in the land development code. And that includes the zoning regulations and the environmental regulations. So we'll talk some about that. And then sort of the last part is permitting and then the future compliance, making sure that folks are in compliance with all these others. So we won't talk so much about that today, but I do think that as we go along and we pick a specific topic and we're down in the weeds, we'll talk more about that sort of last point of the spear. Okay, so the comprehensive plan. And I'm going to just sort of start out by saying I'm not a planner. So we have Clay and Carol in the room. If I say anything dumb, I'm sure they'll interrupt me, or they'll just tease me about it later. So the comprehensive plan is, a document that consists of maps, text, data, and it basically forms the foundation of a county or a local government, their planning program. It sort of sets the way that you want your local government to be and to grow or not grow, or it's just sort of the blueprint for your county or your city. It has various elements. We'll talk about that with goals, objectives, and policies. So sort of like the chart we just saw, there's the sort of the big element, and then goals, objectives, and policies, and then those will then translate into land development or zoning or the specific regulations. Comprehensive plans are required by Florida's Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Land Development Regulation Act. So every local government has one, and there are requirements for when they get reviewed, how often, and those sorts of things. That's Carol and Clay that manage that. So in our case, there are multiple elements within the comprehensive plan. This is the list. We won't talk about all of these. I've highlighted the ones that are most relevant for the work that we're going to do. I feel like I'm off center a little bit. Turn. So future land use is important for the work that we'll do in this committee. Housing, there's some elements, some nuances in the housing element that are important. The groundwater and aquifer recharge element is important to us. Coastal, conservation, and then there is also a property rights element that's relatively new and does impact what local governments can do in terms of regulations. So these elements were included in the background information that on the website. So if you wanted to read them, it was a lot of material, but that's there for you if you want it just for reference. I think as we hit a topic, we'll dig down into these a little bit more. So the things that are written in the comp plan, like the county will support, protection of, undeveloped lands or some broad goal, then they get translated into land development code policies, zoning code policies, et cetera. So we'll see for instance, when we tackle wetlands, we'll look at what are the comp plan elements and policies that deal with wetlands. How does that then come into the land development code, et cetera? One of the important elements in the comp plan is future land use, and that really is what really identifies what you can develop where. So every parcel of land has a future land use, and it identifies what the uses are, the intensities, the densities that can be used on that land use. In the county, we actually have 19 future land use designations, but then we also have local area plans, which are specific to an area. We have 15 designated rural communities that have their own sort of policies, and we have 3 overlays, and we'll talk about 2 of those specifically.
Ginger, would you prefer to go through all the slides? I did see Jack
Oh.
had a question.
Whatever your preference is.
Yeah,
Right with you all that if you want to interject a question, go ahead, Jack.
yeah, I do. A couple different things. The comprehensive plan is put together by the county. Is there a particular division or department that does that alone?
So it's within the Growth and Resource Management Department, Planning and Development Services. So Carol McFarlane is the director of that division. Clay is our department director. And those comprehensive plan changes are the staff is primarily in the planning department, the Planning and Development Services, but it definitely includes staff from all parts of the county, right? So that their traffic and the utilities folks and all that, depending on the element. And then those changes are largely reviewed by the Planning and Development Review Committee.
Right.
Committee? Planning and Land Development Regulation Committee, the
Great.
PLDRC. And then ultimately by the county council.
Okay. And can there be changes made to the comprehensive plan before 2025?
Yes.
Okay. So it changes all the time. It can evolve
Yes.
anytime. I
There
know.
are regular updates, the 5-year evaluation and appraisal, but it can be changed.
Okay.
You want to say something more to that?
Just some, good afternoon, Clay Irvin, Director of Growth and Resource Management. For a long time, there were very specific restrictions on how local governments could amend their comprehensive plan. At that point, they had bifurcation between large scale and small scale. Large scale was anything involving at first 10 acres or anything with more than 10 units per acre. And so the large scale also included any changes to goals, objectives, and policies. Small scale obviously was in it. That has been changed substantially. Also, we were restricted to only 2 times a year, allowing for changes to the comprehensive plan. That has also been removed. So there's abilities to make amendments to the comprehensive plan throughout the year through a variety of process. Also, the time frame through the state review has been greatly reduced.
Is the date 2025? Why is that special?
Well, it's actually going to be going out to 2035 because you have a minimum 10-year planning horizon per Florida statute. So you have to plan for at least 10 years
But
out.
is that a whole new plan or?
No, sir. It's just a continuation and update. We're
Okay.
in the middle of our evaluation appraisal report, is what Ginger was referencing. It used to be a much more detailed process. Now it's basically where you identify what you said you would do, whether or not you did it, and if you need to make changes from that.
Great. Thank you.
Go ahead, John.
Question. So as you make these changes to the comprehensive land use plan, is that staff driven or is that public input into that, the PLDRC? How does that happen when you make changes, and are those landowners notified of those potential changes?
Yes, sir. Everything is done to the comprehensive plan is through a public hearing process, both through the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission, as well as the County Council. We in Volusia County also have the Volusia Growth Management Commission, which is put in place to ensure consistency and compatibility between the local governments. We as staff do not go forward with any changes without direction of the County Council. They are the ultimate group that gives us policy direction. We can't act on behalf of the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission because they are the designated local planning agency. So if they identify something for us to study or update, we do. Individuals have the opportunity to make applications as well. They would have to go through that process of basically a public hearing in front of both the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission and County Council. Depending if it's a large scale, they would also then have to go through a review up at the state to address any kind of state issues that they would have. All right.
Okay, so the future land use basically says, kind of what are the densities, intensities, and then for each future land use, there are certain zoning categories that are considered compatible. And it's the zoning that sets the things like the setbacks and the building heights and the lot coverage. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. And so there are, not to get too far in the weeds, but you could have a future land use and you could have a series of zoning categories that would be compatible. And that would say kind of how many lots you can have per acre, et cetera. And then if somebody wanted to change that, right, they didn't like their zoning or they didn't like their future land use, then that's the process that Clay kind of described. You make application and go through that process. Now, the other parts of the comprehensive plan, say in the conservation element that says, in the natural resource management area, we want higher protection or whatever, those sorts of text changes can also be done. Those aren't typically citizen led, right? It's not an application. But as part of the work that you're doing, as we go along, you see things that you think need to be modified in the comp plan, that is something that we can do, and it doesn't have to be on a particular schedule. Okay. So a couple of those overlays that are in the future land use that are going to be important to our conversations here in this committee. So one of them is the natural resource management area overlay. We call that NORMA. And it was designed to include basically these relatively uninterrupted areas of environmentally sensitive land that should be managed as part of a larger system. The intent is that the area supports a wide range of wildlife, has groundwater supply functions, and provides recreation, aesthetics, and open space. And so in the comp plan, it says that development areas within NORMA are intended to be more restrictive than for areas outside of NORMA. So as we go along, this area will be key, I think, in our discussion. So the map here shows what's been designated as NORMA. The second overlay that I think is going to be important for us is the environmental core overlay, or the eco overlay. And again, this is an interconnected system of environmentally sensitive lands. It includes many of the, or hopefully all of the public and private conservation areas. And it was really designed to link those areas. So the areas that were already in conservation, then the eco overlay was intended to include areas that would link those larger areas, particularly for like wildlife migration, to achieve that connectivity. And it represents land that should receive the greatest degree of protection and suffer the least from development harm.
Melissa?
Just to be completely clear, does this map, the areas in dark blue, reflect, as the text says, private and public conservation areas? So it would include land that we've purchased or the land that has a conservation easement on it?
That's correct.
Regardless of ownership?
Yes, but there's a nuance there. Conservation easement, yes, but not a regulatory conservation easement. So like say a developer had, or even a homeowner, right, had a development, and part of the condition for them impacting wetlands was a conservation easement on the last, the rear 30 feet of their property or whatever. Those easements, those regulatory easements, are not necessarily in this eco map. The true conservation easements that were programmatic would be in here.
But those easements that you referenced that would not be there, those are in force, correct?
They are. They're enforced and enforceable. That's sort of a code enforcement issue at that point. But so, for instance, you kind of see that one leg of the map, the blue that comes down there in the south part of the county, like that's a conservation easement in the Farmton development. So it's both public and private, and then the lands that would connect those to allow that wildlife connectivity.
Jack?
Could you give me examples of the more restrictive requirements in these two layers? Because one is restrictive and one gets more restrictive. Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So like, for instance, wetland buffers, in most of the unincorporated county and in the minimum standard, the wetland buffer is 25 feet. In NORMA, the minimum wetland buffer is 50 feet. The environmental core overlay standards are in the comprehensive plan, but the land development code hasn't been changed since the eco map was adopted. So there aren't land development code increased protections for eco. There are some, so for instance, conservation subdivisions is allowed in our land development code, which would require clustering and a little bit of density bonus if you save all of the wetlands on a property. Like those are only allowed right now in eco and is intended to sort of minimize the impact to those eco lands. So that's a couple of examples.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so that's sort of the end of the section that's about the comp plan. Any other questions about that? We'll talk a little bit about the charter. Okay, so I actually had to go find this information because I didn't even know all of this stuff about the charter. So there are 20 charter counties in Florida out of the 67 counties. And basically, a charter is just a written document that's basically like our own constitution, like the state constitution, but a county that has a charter has their own constitution. And it's believed that that was really about taking a lot of the work off of the state legislature when this happened, so that we're more self-governed and we don't have to go to the legislature for our governance requirements. So for our purposes, what that means is that we can adopt charter policies that then the county is the agency that would enforce them. And for us, it's really the minimum standards, and we'll talk about that. But I thought interesting, there are 20 charter counties in Florida, but they make up more than 75% of the population. Well, that was cool. I got that from the Association of Counties.
Just one note, because I'm proud of it, Volusia County was the first county in Florida to establish a home rule charter.
That is correct. And we'll talk about the charter again when we get to minimum standards. But this little graphic is just to sort of reiterate sort of the hierarchy of land use and development and the process. So if somebody comes in to develop a piece of property, let's say we're not talking about a single family residential. The first thing is, does that proposed development have the appropriate future land use in the comprehensive plan? If the answer to that is no, then they need a comprehensive plan amendment, and there's a process that Clay described. So if they do have the right future land use, then you look at the zoning. Does the property have the right zoning for what they're proposing to do? Or, did they want additional density? If not, then they need a rezoning or a special exception. That's another public hearing. At that point, and I want to point out too, that environmental management reviews comp plan amendments, environmental management reviews zoning amendments, right? So we look at our environmental ordinances at each of these steps. So if something is inconsistent with the minimum standards or the land development code, we have an opportunity at that point to weigh in. And then once they have the appropriate zoning, then they go through either a site plan review, if it's a commercial development, or a subdivision, if it's, a residential subdivision. Again, environmental management and all of the county divisions that are, traffic, engineering, everybody gets an opportunity to comment at that time. And then ultimately you get to the building permit stage. So once you have your site plan in place or you have your subdivision in place, then you apply for a building permit through the building department. And again, environmental management reviews those building permit applications. So there's an opportunity all along to make sure these projects are compliant with our codes. Yeah.
One of the things that Ginger said is that if your land use doesn't meet what you want, you come in and make an application for an amendment. I want to clarify that just making an application doesn't guarantee you that land use. Many times you in the public do not see probably the 20 people that we talk to and say, there's no way we can support this. If you want to make the application, you can make the application, but it will go forward with a recommendation of denial from staff. You don't really see those because most people abandon those projects once they get that. What are we using as the basis for that recommendation of denial? All of those goals, objectives, and policies that are in our comprehensive plan. So if we see something that is inconsistent and not compatible with the existing land use patterns and the future land use patterns, and is contrary to what you see as far as our land use goals, that's what we utilize. And if you look in the staff reports of the request to do comp plan amendments or rezonings, you'll see a series of criteria that are all broken down to that. So therefore, every landowner has the right to make the application, but we as the staff have to use those existing documents to make the determination if it's appropriate to make those changes. If we are making a recommendation of denial, typically the property owner does not necessarily pursue it. Just want to make sure everybody understood.
Thanks, Clay. As Ginger comes up, I realize because we have to be out of here at 3, I do encourage you to just write your questions down so we can run through this real quick. Go ahead, Ginger. Just a reminder.
Okay, so the fourth thing you wanted to talk about was the countywide environmental minimum standards. And these are authorized by the charter, section 202.4, and it establishes minimum standards for the protection of the environment. And in the actual charter, it says these things, including but not limited to tree protection, water quality, stormwater, wetlands, beaches and dunes, and pollution control. But not limited to, right? So that's an important phrase. So these were set in place because really Volusia County was founded on the belief that protection and preservation of the environment is a core value of this county. These standards are intended to provide protection from destruction of the resources of the county belonging to the general public. And I think that's a really powerful statement. And they're also intended to provide consistency across governments. So these minimum standards apply all across the county, even in cities. And the intent there was for that kind of consistency, right? And we can talk about that as we talk about each minimum standard. But so here are the standards that we have right now. These are in chapter 50 of the Volusia County Code. And again, there's links to that on the website. And all of this, of course, is available on municode.com if you're familiar with that. All of the county regulations and most other local governments are there on Municode, which is a really good resource. So here are the minimum standards that we have currently. I've highlighted the ones that you specifically, either the council or this group specifically wanted to talk about at this meeting. So we're going to talk about Indian River Lagoon overlay. We'll talk about trees and wetlands today. We'll talk about beaches and dunes, stormwater, and fertilizer. And Keith is going to go through a little bit more detail about each of these and how the minimum standard compares to our county code. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So again, the minimum standards are intended to be that minimum level of protection. But each minimum standard has to have an implementing ordinance. That chapter 50 is not self-implementing. That's just saying, here are the standards that shall apply countywide. In order to actually implement and enforce those standards, you have to have an implementing ordinance. And there are 3 different ways that those are done. So of our minimum standards, they're implemented 3 different ways. Let me say that. Some of them are implemented countywide and enforced by the county countywide, right? So environmental management staff enforces it, whether it's in a city or in the unincorporated county. Examples of that are the sea turtle lighting ordinance, the beaches and dunes, and the water-wise landscaping, which incidentally is implemented by the health department. But at any rate, it's enforced countywide. Most of the minimum standards are set up in such a way that a local government can implement their own ordinance as long as it is at least as strict as the minimum standard. So City of DeLand can adopt their own tree ordinance. It has to be at least as strict as the countywide minimum standard. Once they adopt that ordinance, then it's on that local government to implement it and enforce it. The county is now kind of out of that conversation. So for instance, we don't see a site plan for a project in the City of DeLand to make sure that it meets the minimum standards, right? It's the city's responsibility once they implement their own code to do that and then enforce it. So the wetland ordinance is that way, the tree ordinance, the Indian River Lagoon overlay. The third option is less common, but it's that a municipality can adopt an ordinance and it doesn't have to be as strict. If they have an ordinance, they have an ordinance. The two that are like that are water conservation and fertilizer. In both cases, the cities that have adopted ordinances, they're the same as the county implementing ordinance and they meet the minimum standard. So, so there's not any real inconsistency. In fact, some of the cities that adopted fertilizer ordinances later kind of got rid of their fertilizer ordinance and the county just enforces it, or it applies countywide. So as we dig into each of these, how it gets implemented is going to be important, right? So for the majority of them that we deal with, that the cities have their own implementing ordinances. You know, when we talk about what we do here in the county, we really have control only over our implementing ordinance. And as we go through, and Keith kind of talks about each one, keep in mind, so there's the Chapter 50 minimum standards. Then for us, our implementing ordinance is called Chapter 72. That's the Land Development Code. And he's going to kind of show you what's in Chapter 50, what's in our Land Development Code. And then for each one, if we've heard either from council or from the development community or the environmental community or from staff, potential changes that would make those codes better or more up to date. So we'll provide you with some of those. Those are the same recommendations or potential changes that went to council at the workshop. And then all of that will help inform your work plan. And so just real quick before I turn it over to Keith, why are the minimum standards important? Remember, consistency across governments and apply countywide. So in the 30 years between 1990 and 2020, our population grew by over 180,000 people. And here's some statistics about sort of what that means to our infrastructure. But in addition to the fact that we grew, the proportion of unincorporated county to cities has changed. So in 1990, 16% of the total land area was in cities. In 2020, the cities had grown. And in fact, the city of Deltona didn't even exist in 1990. The cities have grown. They're now 32% of the land area. So all of the developments that are happening, you think about the area that was the county has now shrunk. So here's the population result of that. In 1990, 40% of Volusia County's population was in the unincorporated area. By 2020, that has gone down to 21%. So 79% of people actually live within a municipality. So those minimum standards really are important. If a lot of the development is happening in the cities and a lot of the people are in the cities, then the minimum standards that set the boundary are pretty important. Okay, any questions on that before I turn it over to Keith for the sort of more details?
Go ahead, Bill.
So are you referencing 1990 just because it's convenient, or when were the minimum standards put in place? The Chapter 50, the charter?
80 something.
Late 80s?
Yeah, 88, 80.
Okay, that's good enough.
Yeah.
Melissa?
So I think I misheard. I had understood last time that a city can adopt a more strict standard, but may not adopt a less strict standard. Is that correct?
That is true, except for the two here, water conservation and fertilizer. Those are worded a little bit differently in Chapter 50. So with the exception of those two, what you said is correct. It has to be at least as strict.
Go ahead.
And in terms of enforcing minimum standards, because 21% is now the land mass that is county land, and because it was a Volusia value to appreciate conservation, the environment, if a city is not enforcing a minimum standard that they've agreed to, because I believe that was the process, they agreed to these standards, if someone were to question them, would the county law still prevail because it's in the charter?
Okay, so good question. 2 points though. 32% of the land area is in the city, so it's the opposite of what's in the county, right? So just want to make that clear. But and And the way that the minimum standards were adopted and the way that they're written, the ones that allow the cities to adopt, is that the cities have had a certain amount of time to adopt a standard after the adoption of the minimum standard. And they could choose not to adopt a standard, and then the county would enforce its own ordinance. And so an example of that is the city of Oak Hill. They've never chosen to adopt a class 2 standard, an Indian River Lagoon overlay standard. And we enforce that in their jurisdiction, and it works great. But so cities had the option to either adopt their own or let us enforce within their jurisdiction. Once they do that, so once they, and at the time that they proposed an ordinance, those ordinances were reviewed for consistency with the minimum standards. So at one point, all of the city's ordinances were compliant with the minimum standards. There's not a great process for ensuring continuing compliance for that. And if there is an instance where a city, either their standard, like the words on paper don't meet the minimum standard, or the words on paper meet the minimum standard, but they're not enforcing their own ordinance, the only real recourse that the county has is to take the city to circuit court. So there's not a really good way to, compel local governments if they're not doing what they maybe should be doing.
Bob?
Yes. How many cities adopt the county's minimum standard?
Well, it varies depending on the standard, right? So only some cities even need the class 2 standard because it's a geographic area. So every city has adopted a tree ordinance. Most cities have adopted a wetland ordinance. Of the 3 cities that could adopt a class 2 ordinance, 2 did and Oak Hill didn't, and we do that. So it really depends on which code we're talking about.
Bliss?
Yes, when we're talking about minimum standards and a land developer is applying, for land change, exceptions, et cetera, are the St. John's Water Management minimum standards and the Army Corps of Engineer minimum standards incorporated or into the counties? Or is this over and above? Is this duplication?
So again, it depends a little bit. So the Army Corps and the state have regulations about stormwater and about wetland protection. The stormwater regulations are, Keith will tell you a little bit more about this, but our stormwater code is really only about the volume of water that hits a site. Our stormwater code does not get into the issue of water quality, where, say, the St. John's standards do. So in that respect, our code is less strict than the St. John's code. On the wetland side, the state rules, and so the way that works, so it's state statute identifies what is the definition of wetland and what are the rules about a wetland. It's implemented in some cases by the DEP, the State Department of Environmental Protection, some cases by the Water Management District. It depends on the type of development. The rules are the same. The district takes the commercial and the ag, and DEP takes the residential. So, so we try to just say the state because it could be either agency, but the county's rules, the minimum standards are more protective than the state standards in some ways, and in some ways it's less protective. For instance, our code has an exemption for wetlands under a ½ acre. They're exempt. You don't have to get a permit for impacts to wetlands that are under a ½ acre. The state does not have that exemption. However, the state doesn't require permits for things like docks or mitigation, and our code says no net loss of wetland function or size. So, and our code is more restrictive in that way. I'll just give as a little bit of a maybe warning or heads up. So the state has continued to erode the things that they require permits and mitigation for. So as time has gone on, our ordinance is actually more protective, more protective, because theirs is getting less protective. So we use the same definitions, we use the same criteria, but we require permits and mitigation for all wetland impacts, except for those under a ½ acre, whereas the state exempts quite a few things.
Okay, Sarah Lee?
Thank you. I think that was a great question. because it illustrates how complicated these regulations are. And one of the things I wanted to say as we move forward, and I'm not sure it's part of today's presentation, but I think it's going to be important for us as we consider revisions to minimum standards, particularly wetlands, tree protection, Indian River. We also are going to need to understand which cities have greater standards than what is currently the minimum. And I'm not sure, you may have to invite city folks to come in to participate, but I think as a county-wide group of citizens who are considering upgrading our standards, we need to make sure we understand that. And you did a great job of showing us how complicated it is.
And we do know that. So Keith and his staff have surveyed all of the city ordinances and talked to all of the city staff. We do know who has ordinances that meet the minimum standard and who implements them and who doesn't. So probably as we deal with each issue, we probably want to talk about that, but it is something that we monitor on a fairly regular basis.
Alex?
So this is a data question, but we know how much the population has changed from from the 90s to now. Do we have any idea of how like impervious surface or urbanized area increased with that population change?
I think there are some estimates, and most of that work is being done by the Regional Planning Council, not by the county. And there are some, I have seen some graphics that show that. I don't know the modeling though that they use to do that. So.
Okay,
Okay,
go ahead.
I'm gonna turn it over to Keith.
Good afternoon. My name is Keith Abramson. I'm the Environmental Permitting Manager in Volusia County Forester. I'm going to be overviewing some of the minimum standards and Chapter 72 Land Development Code of the environmental provisions. Can you hear me? You good? Okay. Now you can. Okay. First one here is the Indian River Lagoon Overlay Minimum Standards. This is a county-wide standard, as Ginger had discussed. So, this applies in that Oak Hill, Edgewater area, and covers state law of the Class 2 waters as defined by DEP. So some of the minimum standards are in this area that 35% of the lot would remain or be planted in native vegetation. It's supposed to, they're supposed to have a stormwater system that collects up to a ½ inch of rain on the lot. It requires the septic systems to be 200 feet away from the water body or canals. The goal was to improve the water quality for shellfish harvesting in the Class 2 areas. The area is bounded on the north by the southern city limit of New Smyrna Beach. So as the city annexes, that Class 2 overlay area changes. So we're kind of losing some of that area every time the annexation happens. That's the basic tenets of the minimum standards. And like Ginger said, we enforce that in Oak Hill and Edgewater and New Smyrna. They have their, or not New Smyrna, Edgewater and Oak Hill have their own. Yeah, it's a little bit short. Here, there we go. All right. So this slide here is kind of showing you the Indian River Lagoon Overlay Zone in the Land Development Code, Chapter 72. This is for the unincorporated area of Volusia County that's in that overlay zone. It has, some of the, it's just more restrictive than the minimum standards. It requires septic systems designed and, and connected to central sewer when available. It also requires the 35% native vegetation in the stormwater requirements as well. And removal of native vegetation is prohibited unless in conjunction with a building permit. So we get a lot of calls. Sometimes someone wants just to clear a class 2 lot just to clear it. And according to that, we cannot allow it.
Keith, may I interrupt? It's me.
Yeah.
I want to say this very respectfully to everybody, but I'm looking through, and so we're already at 146, and we have like 20 more slides to get through. Hopefully everyone took a look prior, and maybe what we do, Keith, if this is all right, just ask your questions related to the slides rather than him go through every slide. And that's because I feel like most of us want to really get into the discussion and some action items. So again, all due respect, I know you put a lot of work into it, and I hope everyone did review, but if maybe we just ask our questions to the slides on this particular set, if anyone had any from it. Great. Are you all comfortable with that? We have till 3. It's a hard stop, and we won't meet again for another month. So we need to really talk about our priorities and work plan. Wendy?
I think I'd prefer just a brief overview of each slide. I mean, maybe not a whole lot of detail on each one, but maybe just a very quick.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Keith.
Thanks.
We can move the LID to another meeting if that will help, unless you want to hear it at this particular meeting.
Well, let Tyler say something, and then Jessica.
I mean, I was going to get back to the question.
Oh, did you?
My apologies. I was going to get back to a question for Keith, which is in the Indian River Lagoon, obviously water quality is something we're focusing on. I saw shoreline protection, vegetation protection. What are the existing problems that we have? Is it a nutrient issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's people have St. Augustine grass to the water, they're fertilizing, these nutrients run off, all of those issues impact the water and impact shellfish harvesting.
So we're getting excessive alga. It's causing an oxygen deprivation. We're having fish kill as a result of that. What we're looking to do is to reduce the nutrients going in. Do we have statistics on the number of septic tanks in the area and the number getting permitted per year?
I do not have those numbers, but I'm sure we do. So, I mean, that's why it's important to have those native vegetation plantings along the waterways and to keep runoff and to keep fertilizers and nutrients from getting into the waterway.
Jessica?
Yeah, I was just going to say on timing and strategy, I agree with Wendy that I want to hit all these topics, but I think county staff has voiced an opinion that LID should not be the first topic we hit because we have the grant funding and other, things coming. So for timing, if we did want to push that and keep the detailed review of this, that may be.
That works. Yeah. Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, that would work. We can talk about LID next time. We're not going to miss anything if we don't talk about it today. We are working behind the scenes on this grant, and we'll give you all the details. We can move all of that to the next meeting, and wouldn't hurt anything.
I have another one over here. You can keep that one.
Thank you. The other alternative is that for each of these, we have a slide that indicates like some potential improvements that were either identified by council or, staff, and we could kind of scooch to that too, if that's something you want to do.
Yeah, that may satisfy what Wendy and Jessica have said. Just hit those
I
high
want to make
points.
sure I understand the Indian River Lagoon though.
Please go through that then. Thank you, Keith.
Okay, I think I've gone through the chapter 50 and chapter 72, basic requirements. The next slide is potential improvements that either council or contractors or the public have brought up to staff. So one of the potential things that you would look at is better defining the hardening of the shoreline. There is some debate on whether like riprap or revetment is hardening. I think staff has felt that, putting riprap, coquina rock, that is a type of hardening. What we're trying to encourage is living shorelines, as you can see in the slide. So, better defining that in the codes is something that would be important. Establishing those specific standards for waivers and other structures. Changing the code definition of the boundary. So if you were to consider like the entire class 2 water body, that would change that area. It would affect the minimum standards because it would also affect the city of New Smyrna Beach. So that's something to consider.
Bliss?
Yes, thank you. When considering the code change definition, for New Smyrna Beach, which you just ended with, is there going to be a time in this process where we, hear from New Smyrna Beach? Are we going to be having any possible interlocal agreements with joint planning agreements with New Smyrna Beach? Or is this, going to be set and
So
forced?
there is a process set out for changes to minimum standards, and it requires notice and comment from the cities. There's nothing that says specifically how that comment has to be. In the past, what we've done is have like meetings where we bring the cities together regionally and say, hey, this is a proposed change. Any kind of change we typically send through the environmental organizations, VCARD, all the other organizations. But if at any time during this process the committee says, hey, we want to hear from this city or the other city, that's certainly something, and then we can invite them to come and see. In this case, there wouldn't be an interlocal agreement because the minimum standards, the charter allows us to have those minimum standards, and then right now the class 2 isn't in the city of New Smyrna Beach at all, right? So, but if that changed, then the city could either choose to adopt those standards in their own codes, or they could choose to have the county implement them.
Do you have any more questions on Indian River
Caroline?
Lagoon? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can you review again? I want to make sure I understand what you understood what you said about two things. Hardening.
Mhm.
I'm confused whether you felt like revetments and if that was considered good and you wanted to see that more often through the waiver process, or I was not clear on what you meant when you spoke to the first bullet.
So better defining what is hardening would probably be the first step. Like vertical facing walls, everybody can agree that's hardening of the shoreline. Secondly, it would be up to the board to determine what you would like to also be considered as hardening. You can use revetment in conjunction with a living shoreline type plantings and other materials, oyster bags. Those are all things that could be included into a minimum standard or Chapter 72 ordinance. So you can make the ordinance more restrictive, which would help a lot of the runoff, a lot of the nutrients from getting into the waterway. So we would potentially, staff would like to better define that. And
I think I can help. So this is the part that I think you missed because I didn't put it on the slide and I only put it in the notes. So the code says right now it prohibits the construction of a vertical seawall or a bulkhead along the estuarine shoreline in the Class 2 area. And it states that hardening of the shoreline shall only be allowed when erosion is causing serious, significant threat to life or property. And the only way that you can get a vertical shoreline or hardening in this area is by a waiver from the county council. And so that's why this bullet about better defining that is here, because that hasn't been well defined in the code. And so if someone comes with a vertical seawall, then that clearly is something that can only be approved by the council. But if someone comes and they want to put in a rock revetment and they want to plant it, it's a little bit unclear with the language right now, whether or not that's something that requires a waiver or whether or not it's something that the staff can allow. So that should be better defined just process wise. And then what we really want to do is encourage people to use living shorelines. And so actually providing some standards in that section would be helpful to that end.
Okay, that helps me. And would not some of these standards also be something that we might consider later on when we look at resiliency issues and outside of the Indian River Lagoon?
Yes.
Bill?
So just to clarify, and I'll save my questions to the end, but what we're talking about here is each of these elements and whether we change them in the minimum standards or we change them in your 72 code and land development regulations. One, if you do it in a 72, it's only the areas that are controlled by the county. But if you do it in the minimum standards, the cities then have to do it also.
Yes, correct. And you can make changes to both. And then it would apply in an unincorporated and in the incorporated areas. All right, next we have the minimum standards for minimum tree standards. Again, this applies throughout the county. Some of the tenets of the minimum standards for the trees are the minimum standards set the one tree per 2,500 square feet of lot area. They also requires the 15% of any development to be in tree preservation. It establishes the standards for retention of specimen and historic trees. And the minimum standards define historic trees as live oaks or bald cypress 36 inches in diameter or larger. So it was adopted in 1988 and revised in 1999. Also requires a permit for removal, topping, damaging trees, that type of thing.
Alex?
As far as the species of trees that were the historics and specimens, was there any, can you give us some insight there?
I really can't. I mean, I was 6 when they wrote this.
That's
So,
fair.
I would like to see additional species add as a county forester and an arborist, longleaf pines or when we get into further slides, there are other species that I believe deserve that designation as well.
Okay.
Jessica?
Just at the county level, Keith, is the 15% based on caliper inches or canopy?
The 15% tree preservation, that's over the lot size. So then the 15% of the entire lot should be in a tree preservation area, any of the development.
So it's not 15% of trees.
15% replacement is in chapter 72.
Okay.
Chapter 50 kind of leaves the replacement criteria up to the cities.
Wendy?
And that 15%, does that include required buffers? Like, can that count as tree preservation area? And does it also include or exclude any stormwater infrastructure?
It doesn't exclude any infrastructure. It's the entire site. So you take that off the top, and it can include landscape buffers, wetland buffers. So you can kind of double dip on those types of areas.
Yeah, the double dipping might be the problem. Thanks.
No further questions? Keith? Right, Bill? You don't have a question. Okay, you want to put your little thing down.
I keep looking at Bill, his cards up. I'm like, all right. So some of the exemptions to the minimum tree standards, are your agricultural uses, your agricultural exempt properties, residential owner occupied lots. So if you own the property, you have a house there, you live there, you're owner occupied, you can remove trees. You can also remove historic trees from your lot. Non-historic trees in rights of way are also exempted, and nuisance species like camphor, Brazilian pepper, those types of non-native invasive species are exempt. So the tree protection standards of land development code, which apply in unincorporated Volusia County. This is where the standards, there are additional standards, more protection for trees. It kind of drills down and requires that 15% replacement of the cross-sectional square inches that Jessica was talking about. It allows for basically 3 ways to replace trees, and that's protection of trees between 2 and 5.9 inches, planting of trees 2 inches caliper or above and paying into the tree replacement trust account. So those are the 3 ways that you plant, pay, and preserve. Only, according to the LDC Land Development Code, only 20% of lots can be cleared within a calendar year. Now you can ask for a waiver for that provision, and that happens quite often. So potential improvements to the tree protection standards would be, to allow some flexibility in the specimen tree requirements based on site conditions. So if you have, a lot of specimen trees clustered in the center, maybe having additional tree replacement or a reduction in the specimen retention type of criteria. Some of the things that we've heard from council and the public are increasing the tree protection areas and maybe environmentally sensitive areas like Norma and Eco. Those are some things that staff has identified. Requiring additional replacement if the developer or development has to clear more than the 20% of the lots in the calendar year. Expand the definition of historic trees. We could include pretty much, any tree that you would like, and also expand the definition of specimen trees to add the longleaf pine and some other things, maybe black gum or whatever species that you're interested in. Also, we've heard a lot about from council and the public about specimen trees or historic trees being removed from owner-occupied lots. So that's an exemption under Chapter 72. Does that exemption need to go away? So that would, if you took that exemption away, that would mean that someone who owned a single-family lot had a historic tree on it. If they wanted to remove it, they would have to come to the county and get a permit and ask for permission to remove it. And if they were granted permission to remove it, they'd have to provide replacement for the historic tree.
Oh, John.
Yeah, you kind of walked right past the agricultural exemption as well, except for bona fide agriculture. Why would you want to change that?
Well, I mean, you have a lot of lots that are small, like A3 lots, an acre and a half. Is that really bona fide agricultural use? We see a lot of those lots building houses on them. They're exempt from the tree code. Should they be? We've heard that a lot from the public. If you have an agricultural exemption and you're using, the parcel, you're clearing it for whatever purpose for bona fide agricultural use, then you would be exempt currently, and we're not trying to change that.
So if you were going to use it for a bona fide agricultural use, then you would be exempt.
Yeah, if you had your agricultural exemption from the property appraiser's office, then you would still be exempt.
10-4.
Jessica.
Just to expand on that, I believe the unincorporated county has a look back provision for ag use and tree preservation, but I don't believe the minimum standards do. So I don't know if you can touch on that.
What is she? Oh yeah, the rebuttable presumption. So in the rebuttable presumption, if someone has an agricultural property, for instance, they clear it, they come in next year for a final site plan, the rebuttable presumption states that basically we would presume that you cleared it for the commercial development. And that's a 3-year time frame. So we've also, the public is also, and council has been interested in or talked about at least increasing that rebuttable presumption time frame from 3 to 5 or 10 or whatever it would be.
Tyler.
I think my question would just be, how do we define bona fide?
That's tricky, and I think we have to use the property appraiser's agricultural assessment if they have that assessment, we have to assume that's bona fide agricultural use.
All right.
All right. So this slide is, oop, I gotta go back. This slide is kind of an overview of the Chapter 50 wetland minimum standards. Again, that applies throughout the entire county. It was adopted in 1989. It requires wetland alteration permit for any alteration of wetland or single-family residential lots. So any clearing, filling, it would require a permit. Unless you have a state permit, then you have met that requirement. Requires a 25-foot buffer throughout the county, and establishes mitigation requirements. So some of the wetland minimum standards exemptions are cleared cleared walking trails, catwalks, bona fide agricultural uses. Again, we look at that if they have a bona fide agricultural exemption from the property appraisers. We typically assume that that is a bona fide agricultural use. Again, Ginger touched on wetlands, 1/2 acre or smaller. So we're talking about isolated wetlands under half an acre. They don't have that buffer or permitting requirements. This slide is identifying the areas of unincorporated Volusia County. This is the Land Development Code wetland standards. This eliminates the exemption for the state permitted impacts. So just because you have a state permit or exemption, it doesn't mean that you're exempt from Chapter 72. And like Ginger had said earlier, docks that are 1,000 square feet or less typically don't require a permit from the state. State has exemptions for wetland fill, 4,000 square feet or less, which doesn't meet our no net loss and size and function of wetlands. Wetland buffer impacts require permits and mitigation under Chapter 72. Chapter 72 mandates the avoidance and minimization. Buffers, this is the portion of the code where buffers are increased to 50 feet in Norma and Eco, and waters that are outstanding Florida waters. The level of permitting is important because we often are able to work with applicants to avoid impacts to wetlands. So, we'll get an application in, they'll have the house right in the middle of the wetland. We'll have them shifted out of the wetland, maybe into the buffer, do some buffer permitting, and they can avoid impacts and avoid state permitting a lot of times that way. So some of the potential wetland protection improvements that we've discussed with council and the public and staff, requiring avoidance and minimization of impacts, to establish guidelines to better define minimization, potentially increasing the buffers in Norma and Eco or wildlife corridors, based on scientific research. It's something that the public has been interested in. Strengthen regulations for buffer disturbances. The council has been considering, we've seen instances where exemptions to agriculture they'll have a lot where the wetland was impacted and they'll say it's for agricultural use, and they'll, come in for a building permit on that. So consider looking at appropriate time frame during which prior wetland impacts would have to be restored or mitigated for development projects, that type of thing.
Wendy has a question.
Yeah.
I was going to wait for you to finish the slide, but so does this also include, when you talk about impacts to wetlands, do you also include in that the conversion of a wetland to a lake. So if we've actually developed all around the wetland and put in these big fill areas such that we push water permanently into the wetland area, thus causing it to become a lake. Does you know what I'm talking about? It's happening all over the county.
So what you're saying is like you fill an upland piece of property and then that forces the runoff and water into the wetland system. Is that what you're saying?
Right. And because you have less infiltration in the upland area, and therefore, water runs off into the wetland, piles up in the wetland, doesn't percolate as quickly as it might in the upland area. And so it accumulates. So you no longer have a wetland ecosystem, you have a lake. And you're looking confused, like you've not seen this happen like within the past month. So
I think the easy answer is yes, it's still protected because
Okay.
the definition of wetland in state code is wetland or surface water.
Okay.
And there's criteria basically that identify what is considered a jurisdictional wetland. Surface waters are included in that definition.
Okay.
So it wouldn't lose protection because it becomes more of a surface water than a traditional vegetated wetland.
Okay.
That doesn't solve the issue of that conversion, but the body itself is still protected and the buffers still apply.
Okay. So the conversion, I think we'll want to review as we move forward. And then my other question, and I'm sorry if I'm getting ahead of things here, but I know this is kind of a federal and state level designation as well, but is there some reason why we prioritize the protection of wetlands and we don't prioritize the protection of uplands, because they too are sensitive ecosystems that deserve protection? I'll just stop with that.
Hold that thought.
Okay.
Because we'll talk about that.
All righty.
Yeah.
So we also have in chapter 72 in the definitions, the wetlands wetlands and surface waters are in that definition. So they're still protected. Typically wetlands do get inundated and can handle that inundation. So forgot where I was at, but as you can see on the slide, requiring permitting mitigation and conversion, of the wetlands, what time frame would we be looking at? Like the rebuttable presumption in the tree code is 3 years, and we're talking about increasing that. So I would kind of feel like whatever is consistent with that time frame as well. Considering impacts and different standards for buffer impacts. So, increasing buffer sizes in NORMA, ECO, maybe in riparian habitat protection zones, OFWs, those types of issues. So these are the beaches and dune minimum standards, or some of them. It was recently updated in 2021. It regulates coastal construction activities, requires permits for erosion, excavation, sand placement, dune restoration, armoring, maintenance, all those things. Establishes standards for dune walkovers, requires creation of planted dune in front of all armoring projects. We don't have any identified changes due to the recent update. Beach and dune minimum standards exemptions, planting of native species, debris removal, and maintenance and repair and replacement.
Wendy, do you have a question? No, okay.
So these are the stormwater minimum standards. It requires, the minimum standards require approval of stormwater plan by local government. Agricultural pursuits, single family residences are exempt from the standards. It requires that we ensure that pre-development conditions remain in post-development condition. We coordinate with St. John's River Water Management District. The exemptions are agricultural pursuits. Stormwater in Chapter 72, which is the unincorporated area of Volusia County. Exemptions are construction of one-time 1,000 square feet or less, closed landlocked basins. Some of the potential stormwater improvements that we've discussed is incorporate LID methods into the stormwater, add stormwater treatment performance standards to reduce nutrient loading and offsite discharge, increase reduction in OFWs, and our standards, like Ginger had mentioned earlier, do not address nutrient removal and stormwater, only volume. The management district does have standards for nutrient removal in the areas where water quality is impaired. Some local governments require additional nutrient removal. The fertilizer minimum standards that are in Chapter 50 are in the entire county, unincorporated and incorporated, requires 50% slow release nitrogen. Fertilizers containing nitrogen, phosphorus shall be applied through June 1st through September of each year. Fertilizers containing phosphorus can only be applied if the soil test determines that it's needed. And this establishes the 15-foot fertilizer free zone adjacent to water bodies.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes, no, Jack?
I
You put it
took
back down. Okay.
Put it down. Thank you.
Some of the exemptions for the fertilizer minimum standards are bona fide agricultural operations, golf courses, things like that. So some of the potential improvements that we've discussed require fertilizer informational signage at retailers, increase the fertilizer free zone. One of the ideas that we've had is maybe meet that 25-foot minimum standard to wetlands and surface waters, just to be more consistent. Right now, signage is optional. So some of the other topics that have been recently discussed at council in the public is a pause on increased density and intensity, LID standards, ordinances that protect habitat. So that would be upland habitat, scrub jay habitat, things like that, gopher tortoise habitat. Standards related to sea level rise. Currently, our codes do not specifically protect upland habitat, like we had discussed earlier. You have any questions on any of that?
John?
Just a general question as far as the municipalities and sewage waste and those type of minimum standards. Do we have any of those type minimum standards in our charter?
Not in the environmental minimum standards section, other than what exists in the Indian River Lagoon overlay, which does address sewage disposal. It's a complicated issue because the municipal boundaries and the utility service areas are somewhat different, right? So for instance, Volusia County operates a utility in the city of DeBary, and Ponce Inlet gets their water from Port Orange, right? So the boundaries are all kind of wonky, but there isn't anything in the environmental minimum standards that specifically addresses septic tanks or municipal waste systems other than what we talked about in the class 2.
Can I ask why not? I mean, and that's just an up in the air question.
Yeah, I don't actually know the why not on that, other than utilities operate as a quasi-government authority, right? So I think there are probably some state rules that deal with that, but I don't really know the answer.
DEP operates or oversees that, or
They're all
Department of Health?
permitted by the DEP for sure. So all wastewater treatment plants, all water water plants, they're all regulated by the DEP, and those rules come down from the Clean Water Act, and they're implemented through the state. So we certainly are preempted from some types of regulation, like the operation of a plant or what the standards are that a water plant has to meet to make it potable for the public. Those are all federal and state regulations.
Right. Jack?
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit overwhelmed by all of this, and but I appreciate it, and I keep thinking, I keep looking at my watch, and 40 minutes. You know, I don't know how we're really going to bite into a lot of it. And I look at this with the other topics, and these are significant subjects. You're talking about a moratorium on growth, and these are things that we could spend months just addressing the other topics. But let me ask one thing that kind of came up before. We're talking about future things when we're talking about all these rules and whatnot. And I'm wondering about why there isn't more addressing of these issues as they exist today. In other words, I know, for instance, runoff, you know, terrible runoff situations that exist today, and we're saying, hey, we ought to protect against this runoff, and I'm wondering why we're not addressing it, at least as a county, and saying, why isn't the runoff being taken care of at this moment?
Okay, well, that's a loaded question.
Yeah, it's kind of loaded.
But so I think one thing, and the reason we put in the dates that these were adopted was because many of these rules were adopted a very long time ago and haven't been substantially updated in a long time. And so our wetland code, for instance, I mean, many of the things that are in there are that's completely not the way the state even regulates wetlands anymore, right? Our code doesn't reflect current practice, and it's a difficult process to do code updates. And so that's why we're all here, is to get some of those updates done. But we know better now, right? So in a lot of cases, we know better. We you know, low impact development is you know, something we know about now. So I think we have an opportunity to make those changes. I don't think it's that we were, you know, ignoring them or whatever. It's that we just know more now. And so, but to your stormwater question, this is sort of what the regulations are for developers. In addition to that, of course, the county operates a stormwater utility in which we really do a lot of projects to improve flood control, stormwater quality, and those sorts of things. So our ordinances aren't the only way that we address some of these issues, but that's kind of what this group is tasked with looking at, if
Yeah,
that answers your question.
Thank you. Actually, that's very helpful. And so, yeah, we do have mechanisms to address the current circumstances. So we're just trying to put better regulations going forward. Yeah, thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to fill in a little history because the stormwater issue is something that hasn't been managed or regulated for most of the history of our state. So, you know, our stormwater regulations came into, you know, an existence, probably the beginnings of it were in the 70s. And, you know, it's been refined and refined and refined, you know, to where we are today. Much of the flooding that you saw during, you know, Ian's visit is actually due and, you know, directly related to the fact that we spent 100 years developing without any regulations. You know, today's regulations, you know, if something was built to, you know, the regulations of the last 20 years, all the projects that I'm familiar with, they did fine. They didn't pitch any water outside their boundaries. They maintained every drop, but that doesn't mean that the people next to them didn't flood from a development that was, you know, put in there in the 1940s or 50s or 60s.
Bliss?
Thank you. And I am in agreement with what Bob said. However, I would like to point out that, you know, I'm from Southeast Volusia, and there are historic photographs which document a storm of 100 years ago, back in 1924, 23 inches of rain came down in 24 hours. And some of the same areas that flooded then flooded now. And so that has not been impacted by all the development around it.
All right.
So we'll bring Katrina back next meeting.
Yeah,
maybe?
sorry, Katrina. I mean, again, I apologize for the aggressiveness there all. I was thinking my priority was definitely to show action sooner than later, but I do realize you all we need to have agreement on that. But how about we do jump to goal setting? And to clarify, the reason we're saying that is because the county received a grant to define LID standards through the University of Florida, and as long as this group is comfortable, we should work in tandem with that, walk alongside them, and they're not quite there yet. So shall we go to goal setting? Okay, this is going to be interesting. There was on the website, those who replied had put up their priorities, and I talked to Ginger, and she could not aggregate this, as you can see, because we're coming at it from different angles. So this is a great opportunity, I do think, for us to understand what everyone's expectations are and what you hope to achieve on this ENRAC, and hopefully we can that will help kind of guide our future presentations and questions. But Ginger's handing out that printout, if you saw those or not, but not everyone replied anyways. Yeah. So I think it would be good to open up. Let's have a little conversation around what I know Tyler articulated. Are we going high level goals? And then Jessica said, well, that's the comprehensive plan. But let's share a little bit about what is our expectation for this ENRAC. I obviously have my thoughts, but I'll hold them for now. So I'll open up for Jessica.
I would say I put it in my top 5, and I agree that they're kind of all over the board, but there are some common ones that stand out. What I'm seeing is that I personally think we'd be remiss, and I know some were recently updated. Thank you. We'd be remiss if we didn't at least read through fully all of the existing minimum standards, even if we group, maybe 3 of the smaller ones in one meeting and we say there's not really many changes that need to happen here. But I think we should look at all of the ones that are existing, and I am seeing the creation of a few new ones. I know habitat, sea level rise, resiliency, those stand out across the different topics. So that's at least what I see.
Sarah Lee.
I thought, so I'm not married. I'm one of the few that submitted, but I'm not married to my priorities. What I feel committed to as a member of this committee is it's long overdue to revisit not just the existing standards we have. And I think you showed us very well that it's time for that, and pointed out some good examples of things that could change. But I also think there's a number of issues that are not currently addressed that absolutely need addressed. And what these priorities told me from those that were submitted, we as individuals can make arguments for one is more important than the other, but in general, I think they're all important. And I get a sense that all of us would like to see us accomplish some work. I do not think this is easy work. And I do not think that this is going to be a group that necessarily agrees on everything that comes forward. And I think there may be a lot of discussion. And we need to plan for that, quite frankly, especially because upgrading minimum standards needs to be applied in the cities, not just in the county. So I believe that the last our first meeting, there was a little bit of discussion about, what are we ready to tackle? Like, does the staff have something that they'd be ready? I want to see us move forward. And to move forward, I think I personally want to defer to what you have ready for us. And I want to caution you, the staff, that because like when I saw today's agenda, I was like, holy cow, no way. I mean, there was no way we were going to get through all of this. We have got to respect the differences that exist up here and make sure that we provide time for good, deep conversation and understanding. Because I think anything that moves forward from this group to the county council means that it's been well vetted. And that would mean it's good for the council to consider.
Thank you. Bernie?
Thank you. I was just going to say, quick comment. It seems like there's a lot of recommendations that come from staff. Obviously, they're the people that deal with this day in and day out. And I feel like it might be good just to kind of run down the list of the improvements that they suggested, the minimum standards and other things they told us to look at, and just kind of use that as a guide as far as what we should look at for our goal setting moving forward. And then if time permits, we can throw in additional topics and other hot things that come up. But I imagine they probably know best what really needs more definition and explanation.
I would agree with that. Melissa?
Thank you. When I was ranking, I took sort of a pragmatic approach and looked at the list of things like that are in the minimum standards and the list of things that were in that county work plan to try to rank them for myself. And so my expectation wasn't that that would be necessarily the only list of things that we would look at, but that we would go through each one and do a deep dive. And for me, deep dive includes hearing from experts. Excuse me, if we think we need to hear from experts and hearing from each other and really hashing it out. I agree with what Jessica said and with what Sarah Lee said, that we are responsible for really digging into this and taking a deep look. I also agree that we could choose to look at low-hanging fruit first, which are things like the tree ordinance that you have stated is further along. Thank you.
I think I saw Tyler.
So I think one of the things that stood out to me from the presentation is in 30 years, we've grown 50% in population in the county. And I expect that in the next 30 years, we're probably going to grow another 50%, which is actually more than what we grew in the last 30 years by numbers. And a lot of what we're talking about, if we put it in place, we physically won't be able to. We can't have a moratorium on increase in density and restrict the land that we can build on and grow. Like if we restrict ourselves, we won't be able to afford housing. I will leave. My kids won't be able to afford to live here. It will be problematic. And so I look at this as we have a responsibility to find that balance and to find what we can reasonably protect and what is really important for us to protect, and to prioritize those areas first and maybe leave some of the areas that ultimately could lead to the controversy that I see that, Sarah Lee was speaking about maybe for our later topics. And, one of the things that I think we universally are pretty in agreement on is that we have some water quality issues throughout the county. And there are some good solutions to our water quality issues. And we have some flooding problems. And a lot of that deals with stormwater code. And that is an area that I didn't see nearly as many suggestions for changes coming in the guidance, the list here that's, like canned ready for us to shoot at. Personally, I think changing tree code doesn't address the big things that we're trying to address. I think changing habitat protection standards and looking at where our connected and preserved lands today are and prioritizing the protection of the lands that feed into those and provide connections that are not currently preserved and protected would be where I would prefer to prioritize our efforts.
Wendy?
Well, Tyler just took half of what I was going to say, but very, very well said, Tyler. I was going to say, even before defining priorities, given, the lists of topics we've been presented with, I mean, I wonder if we can have some guiding principles that we could all agree to. Principles like, we don't want to run out of clean water. How about that? That's a good place to start. None of us want to run out of clean water. We do want to protect wildlife habitat. We want to protect the quality of life for our existing residents, before we plan for new residents. And we want to acknowledge that climate change is real and that the impacts extend beyond sea level rise in our county, including flooding, drought, agricultural production, et cetera. So those would be some guiding principles that, regardless of which particular item in the code that we're looking at, we keep these in mind and, and let those inform our decision making.
Thank you. Melissa, did you?
I just wanted to be clear. I wasn't advocating that we start with tree protection. It wasn't number one on my list, but there has been a lot of energy around it and a lot of concern in the community. And I think for that reason, staff has developed, that was the only reason. It was something I saw we could get done very quickly, perhaps. I like the idea of principles, although our charter does state what this is for.
Jessica?
Yeah, no, I was just going to build on what Wendy said, because I think some of those policy statements have been wordsmithed beautifully, I think, in the comprehensive plan, and we didn't dive into that. We don't have time. But us as a group pulling those out as our guiding tenets, the provisions on quality of life and preservation of natural resources and water quality that exist in that comp plan as kind of our divining rod, if you will, to keep us on track. What we do in Volusia Forever, I think, is we all have opinions, but we have parameters that we've said, this is our guidepost. This is what we're going to measure all of our actions off of. And it really gets us over a lot of those concerns.
Jack.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I look at it in a pretty broad stroke way, and I think we're touching on it. But in the broadest sense, I think we're looking at balancing the development of the county against our environmental needs, and all of this is a quality of life issue, right? That's the whole thing here. And so I look at it in very broad stroke terms as far as goals. When I say goals, I'm looking at the goal being pretty high, and then we get all the way down into code. Well, that's getting specific. And so I think the topic is too large to grab onto, at least for me. I think we ought to be chopping it down when we start with the biggest things, and our goals are pretty broad. And then we say, okay, let's narrow the field down and get all the way down into code. And I think we'll have to identify the priorities and say, okay, are they something you're further along with, or how we want to do it? That's great. But I think to take it down and say, oh, we should concentrate on anything first, I think we need to agree with the large stroke position. Because if you remember how this thing got developed within the county council, and we said ENRAC was created, a lot of that was the trade-off against development and environmental concerns relative to quality of life. That's why we were created. And so we're getting down in there, looking at these other things. All of those things are associated, whether it be runoff or wetlands, it's all there. So I think the challenge is to go from the big picture subject down into the narrow subjects and then make some decisions. But to actually bite into those, I mean, we're going to have to get down in it, and there's a lot there. So I can really appreciate particularly what Tyler said. And to me, this is it's a challenging circumstance. I wouldn't call it daunting, but it's pretty big. And so I think we're going to need a lot of focus, and it's going to take a lot of time. I don't know that we can get, how we break it down, I think will be the biggest challenge for the group.
Right. And we have 20 minutes.
Let's
So
wrap it
John,
up.
if I may real quick, from all your comments, and maybe a way to satisfy everybody is we got to take some action now. Why doesn't staff come back on a tree protection piece they have recommendations? Wasn't that right, Ginger? Is that okay? They live and breathe this stuff. They already know some very obvious things that need updating. That's our quick action that they can take on. And then we can take on, as Jessica and Wendy have mentioned, what are those guiding principles by looking through the comprehensive plan. And again, I said this at the first meeting, I really think we have to do our homework prior so that we don't spend these meetings learning, but we ask questions and really start taking action. So maybe we start, I agree, Jack, for us to have the whole architecture of what we're going to do, I don't think is possible at this point. Let's bite the elephant, eat the elephant one bite at a time. So gross, isn't it? If we could take two pieces, I'm just putting it out there. I'm going to allow John to say his comments. I see Bill, and then maybe we should have a motion for some action to take before our 19 minutes is up. John?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm going to refer back to the last presentation in our last meeting where the council formed this advisory committee based on what we saw, these 6 principles, and that was slide 28, I believe. We're getting out in never land in a lot of this stuff, which not saying it doesn't need to be addressed, but the reason we were formed was because of these topics that the council had identified. I think we should work on those topics as a priority because that's what the existence of this committee was about. Thank you.
Agreed. Bill?
So I agree that we need to have big principles, and in the comp plan, that's where they're at. I think we need to understand what is already regulated by state and federal agencies, and then look at the minimum standards and find out if we want to make changes to the minimum standards or if we want to make changes to the land development regulations, because those minimum standards will then be pushed into the cities. And I don't know that the cities want that. They are already not wanting to abide by the minimum standards anyways. So I think it'll be way more complicated to push those or to change the minimum standards. And then ultimately we need to come up with code revisions, right? That's our goal, is to come up with something that that staff can send to the county commission and say, these are the rules that we're going to now change, and this is the exact language, right?
Jessica? Oh, I'm sorry. All right. So hopefully everyone had an opportunity to talk who wanted to kind of give their view on how we move forward. I would love to see us take some action today. I did like what John said. Maybe we just defer back to what was in that original presentation that the county council would like us to tackle. And let me just clarify, are we saying we do not want to look at the comp plan and look at those guiding principles? What I think could happen, I think someone should volunteer to look at the comp plan and pull out those guiding principles, and we can review that. Wendy?
So I volunteer to do that. And we'll bring those back to the next meeting or send them to Ginger beforehand so she can distribute beforehand. And also agree with you, Carrie, that we should at least agree to take on a couple of the 6 items, within our next couple of meetings. I will clarify, I think that those 6 items were brought to county council by staff. County council agreed to those 6 items. County council didn't come up with those 6 items. Staff did, and staff are now presenting them to us as well. So I do think that those are, the elements that are most tangible that we could be working on. And yes, if tree preservation is the easiest to tackle because it's already halfway fleshed out, then that is an easy and fast win. So I would make a motion to start with tree preservation.
Very good. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Jessica? All right, in discussion? Jessica?
Sorry, I say I like the table tents. They're fun. I was going to say, I do agree. I think we should do our homework before, and I think I'll look at the comp plan too. I think everyone should look at it. I love that, we'll send it to Ginger. She can share it with the team, and we can be ready to kind of adopt those as our guidelines. I think that some part of these presentations will be education, though. I mean, it would be great to come here and say, we've drafted it, we're ready, but we're not going to do that, especially with the new topics. So I agree that trees does seem like the easiest. I think we've pushed LID to the next meeting. So LID and trees will run out of time on that alone. And then I would suggest perhaps, and we can talk about it more after, the next easiest one, if we do want to review all of the standards, if beaches and dunes was just updated, maybe that's easy too. And so that would be a quick one.
Yeah, if staff can handle those 2 pieces to bring back. And what we're saying is the motion is for trees to be brought back with the recommended language that we can review and vote on. That was okay. Ginger, would you like to say something before we vote?
I just want to be clear about what you're looking for, because I feel like you had a little bit of information about the tree ordinances today, but it's much more nuanced, of course, than what Keith told you today. So are you looking for that deep dive from us into what it all says and what it all means? I mean, obviously we'll provide the ordinances in advance, but so I guess I'm looking for what level of detail do you want from us? My guess is you're going to want us to get down into the nitty gritty. And then where we have worked out suggestions, or language will provide that. Some stuff is though still up in the air. Like, do you want to have more than 15% tree preservation area? And if the answer is yes, how much do you want? Right. And so there are questions that are not resolved. There's a lot of language that we've already written.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so I'm thinking that's a deep dive.
Okay. All right. I'm going to hear from Tyler.
I'll try to be quick.
Yeah.
I think stuff like the percentage of preservation that gets more for me into habitat protection. I personally believe that by clustering our communities, having a certain level of green space that we preserve, whether it's existing or replanted, things of that nature, that we can prevent sprawl and protect more valuable habitats and actual corridors for our wildlife that still exists in the area. So I personally don't like increasing the amount of land that has to be set aside and not touched on projects, especially as we start dealing with smaller and smaller chunks of land that have been cut up. So I am very interested though in the changes to the species that would be considered for specimen, the sizes, if there's changes proposed there, historic trees, that part of the conversation.
Okay. Bill? Jack?
Yeah, my point's a simple one. I think relative to the agenda on the next meeting, I think we'd be remiss if we don't at least put some sort of goal setting placed in that. We really need to establish, even if it's short stuff, in three goals, but we've got to decide. I think as a group, we need goal setting and a discussion about that so that we have some total big picture discussions and direction going forward. I think it needs to be on the agenda next time.
Right. And was what John proposed of taking what the staff presenting to county council appropriate as our goals?
I don't recall what those 6 things are, but I think we could go through
Okay.
those.
We'll
and
put
would
that
be
on the
fine.
agenda to relook at that and
Okay.
vote on that. Now, we still have a motion on the floor. Let's try to get an action taken. And Ginger just needs clarification for next time when we talk about the tree ordinance. Why don't, and I'll wait for Ginger to.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. How about we have her come back with those questions that are going to be outstanding, come back with an education piece about where it stands and its implications, and then we can get into the weeds on what yes, no, this, that, okay? But that will be the action item for today. Who did I say? Sarah Lee? Oh, I'm sorry, Bill. I'll have you next. Go ahead, Sarah Lee. Bill? Okay. Who?
Me?
I'll go. I would just like clarification on whether we're going to have them come back with recommendations for changing the minimum standards or the Chapter 72 land development
I
codes.
have an idea about that. And so what we've done in the past is where we've identified a change that has to happen. We've looked at, does that also require a Chapter 50 change? Some things don't. If we're just changing something in our code, it doesn't require a Chapter 50 change. So I think what we'll do is probably some sort of matrix that is, here's the thing, the section that we're talking about, and does it require 50 change or 72 change or both? And that'll, I think, make it a little bit more clear. Rebecca hates those kind of charts because they're not really very ADA compliant, but I think it's easier to visualize that way. And then that way you'll know. And then you could say, if the majority of the group says we don't want to mess with Chapter 50 or what the cities do, then okay, we limit ourselves to only the things that don't require a Chapter 50 change. If the group says we think that's important, then we'll know what those things are. So I think we can manage that. So I
Are you
heard
satisfied with that,
bring
Bill?
back the things that are relatively easy, identify the things that require discussion
on trees.
trees. Agenda the guiding principles.
Yeah,
Right.
to
Talk
review
about the
that.
guiding principles. We'll get those ahead of time out to everybody. And and do the primer on low impact development that
And
we
do the
didn't
primer,
today?
yes, which we could do after we hit trees. And Sarah Lee, Ginger, you're clear? You feel good?
I think I'm good.
Okay, Sarah Lee?
Yeah, I was going to echo some of, or I was going to say some of what Bill said, the distinction between whether it's so I like your idea about the matrix, and I think that could vary by what our subject matter is.
Absolutely.
In terms of what we may wish to do with it or not. Going back to something Tyler said, and establishing the goals, it would be personally the water quality issues, which I think cross several different subject matter issues. We may want to look at how does water quality get addressed. You know, you're not going to tackle 3 different subject matter all at the same time. However, 3 different subject matter may in fact be water quality. And we may as a group want to say, well, you know, water quality is a higher priority than, I
Sure.
don't know,
Yeah,
habitat.
sure.
I don't know. I'm
So,
just
so what I
saying.
think we do is we're going to take that slide from the original presentation so everyone can see it. We'll have that on the agenda to vote, and we will look big picture how this impacts water quality and if we want to rearrange a couple of things. So I have that down too, Ginger.
Oh, and the last thing I was going to say, I think whatever you bring forward is a detailed dive.
I think so too.
It will need to be, and I won't stop them again next time. So, can we
So-
have, go ahead, Ginger.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. So we want to have the guiding principles discussion, which is somewhat different than the work plan or.
Correct.
Right? So
Correct.
2 things.
Two items,
Okay.
yes. Guiding principles, then we'll hit goals starting off with the slide from the initial presentation, and we'll make an asterisk to make sure we address water quality within that. You'll come back with trees. We'll hash that out. And I do want to add on there for next, we'll do low impact development and minimum standards and how we impact the cities does need to be a big agenda item. I have many things to say on that. So we have a motion on the floor for the trees for them to, if we need a motion, to bring that back.
So I heard a motion, I thought.
Yeah, we did.
Right,
Wendy had a motion, Jessica seconded. So all in favor for the trees coming back as our, action item out of the gate? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None. Motion carries. And we have 7 minutes. So let's see what the agenda. We are already scheduled for next December, and after that, we have to wait for the county council schedule, correct?
Our next meeting is December 7th at 1 o'clock. And I'll check and see if there's something after us. It obviously be better if we, we're a little bit flexible on the time, but the council
Yeah.
chambers are hard to get. So I'll let you know, but we do have that one booked. And then, yes, we'll kind of have to wait because the council will set their schedule and that will then affect every other meeting that happens in here. So.
Let's open up for general discussion, comments. Go ahead, Sarah Lee.
I have a question. Have we heard something from the cities? I mean, what do we know about their interest in any of this? Do we know anything?
We don't know anything lately. We did a series of presentations to the cities probably 2 or 3 years ago. Where's Clay? I don't know. A few years ago. And in general, they're not super excited about having some other thing that they have to comply with, that it wasn't their own idea. And it's a real mixed bag, I'll have to say. Like some cities are just like really great at protecting something, their standards are more than the county standards, and that's a priority for that community. It's really variable across the whole county.
So if I may, I was going to hold it back, but when we talk about the cities, these are grown adults, and we all know we don't want to be told what to do. I just put this as a seed being planted. When we talk about minimum standards and enforcing on the cities, I think we're going to be more effective because if you get their buy-in and their excitement level, and there can be a whole campaign to get the city's buy-in where they adopt it because they want to and because their citizens tell them to, not because an advisory council tells them to, and then we can't enforce it anyways. So that's why I do want it to be an agenda item, so we can really dig into a strategy for engaging the cities and getting them really excited about adopting higher minimum standards on their own accord. Any other comments? We have 4 minutes. Jessica?
I would just say from an agenda standpoint, I think we noted in our first meeting that some of these topics may take 2 or 3 meetings. And so I just don't want anyone to feel pressured during one meeting. Like if we do trees next time, if we get to the end and we still have to look up, what should be specimen, what should be historic, and we ask staff questions and they haven't had time to research it, it may take more than once, and that's okay. And so that's why I think starting agendas with like educational topics like LID and then transitioning into the deep dive and the regulations may be more helpful, because I think we can eat up 2 hours on trees easy, I think, and maybe another 2 hours a month from then. And so I just want to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Any other comments? Great. All right, we are adjourned.